My title is Environmental Chaplain, and you probably therefore think environmental spirituality, which is one of the titles that you've sent me, should be my stock in trade. I've also been an Iona community member for about 27 years, following a very formative time as volunteer guide. So showing people around, putting the services together at a time when J. Philip Newell was the warden. Now, Philip has written a huge pile of books, and he's got a huge following on the far side of the Atlantic. And so I ought to have soaked in something Celtic, not least the habit of enjoying a reflective swim in the sea in the early morning, even if I haven't yet managed to arrange the services of the otters who came to dry off St. Cuthbert after his daily dip off Lindisfarne. Now, that's a story that most folks smile about. I think it was intended also to provoke wonder at the time it was told. But as we heard in the prayer this morning, courage and faith go together with cheerfulness. And when things are as strange and fragile as they now seem to be, it may be in our joking that we first encounter a truth that we later have to deal with. Anyone heard of Calvin? People tend to think of Calvinism as a very sort of strict and austere sort of thing. When reformer John Calvin was asked about bitey insects and annoying bugs and things like that, he replied that in those we encounter God as avenger. And I thought that was probably some evidence that Calvin, apart from being the proud possessor of one of the finest private collections of wine in Geneva, actually had a sense of humour. That wasn't, though, all there is to it. Because, again, the insects, the little things that break things down, actually are, in a way, God's way of frustrating the ambitions of people who try and make things permanent and try and be powerful and try and control everything. I've had also cause to reassess many scary things that safe, respectable Christians don't touch with a barge pole. And one of those is the wrath of God. People think of that as bloke with a white beard up there getting really peevish if you do something that they don't like too much. But in the Old Testament in particular, and also in the Bible, think of it more as cause and effect. The wrath of God is what you bring on yourselves. Jump off a cliff, you experience the wrath of God in the injuries you sustain when you land. Burn fossil fuels for a few centuries on the unprecedented scale we have, and you destabilise the balance of nature that all current life depends on. This sort of wrath is what you bring on yourselves, though this version, to our even greater distress, also afflicts those around you, because we live in community. You might deserve what's coming to you, but unfortunately your neighbour gets it too. In a time of crisis, some of the stuff we have fought shy of, like justified fear, and where it leads us, also need to be reassessed. Again, people have said to me as I was growing up or earlier on in the church, in the Bible it says do not be afraid 365 times. Every day you could say do not be afraid. But quite frankly, that is the response when there is something downright worth being afraid of. Greta Thunberg, that great prophet of our time, I want you to panic, I want you to be afraid, your house is on fire. She's looking at there so clearly that what is it that we need to shift us? And at times, the fear that comes from knowing what's going on, though you don't want to live in fear, has its values. So, I think I'd say again, this used to be a joke, but let's use it now. I'm Scotland's happiest apocalyptic preacher. I've also been surprised how thoughts we might entertain as jokes turn out, while remaining jokes, to be rather more than that. I'm Jeremiah, which people would think of as a prophet of doom, but I'm also, in the Bible, Barnabas, the one who encourages. Both those brought together. Now, the courage, faith and cheerfulness prayer, and we had it this morning, which was great, is one of the foundational texts of the Iona community. When I'm talking to congregations about possible environmental actions, I also try and encourage them to find things that they love and enjoy, because they're not going to keep on doing it if they hate it. Membership of the movement that I'm working for is to enrich, not to diminish people's faith. Though as chaplain I also maintain a strong emphasis on what we call grace, sort of God's undeserved favour. It is, after all, the idea that we can do everything, even everything right, that is actually killing the planet. If we think we can do everything, if we think we're in charge, that actually is the attitude which is doing so much harm. An environmental spirituality, I'd say, looks then to a better life rather than just a harder one. My dear friend Pope Francis, for whom I'm very grateful, said something rather like, you might be totally involved in justice and peace and environmental action, but don't lose sight of your joy in that, because that will sustain you. And we do have certainly we have this early lockdown experience of birdsong and clean air and clean water, which shows us that big changes can happen. And actually, we sometimes appreciated them. Certainly, as a cyclist, not getting run over when I go on the road, that was brilliant. And actually, since I started this job, and it's a job which I really would say could be done by anyone with a perfectly normal training for Christian ministry, I've had more fun with the Bible than ever. And what had been vacuums in meaning for parts of my faith are being filled in. Maybe provisionally, but for now that's happening. The things that we sort of carry on and say because we think we ought to say them, for many people that would be the Father, Son and the Holy Spirit on Trinity Sunday. But those things are there. Those are like treasures set aside. And sometimes you get them down for the mantelpiece and they actually are worthwhile. So, as I said, the great mystery of the Trinity becomes, for me, a powerful impetus for the most radical inclusion of life on earth. And human equality and injustice. As the prophets were well aware, especially my friend Jeremiah, injustice invariably goes with harm to the earth. It's been said that one of the greatest steps that could be taken to mitigate the crisis is a worldwide campaign to empower and educate women in those places where society neglects this. I know people sometimes say, overpopulation, it's all those poor people having too many children. Remember never to blame the poor when the lifestyles of the richest and most powerful people on the planet have environmental impacts hundreds of times the size of someone in poverty. And the birth rate drops when poverty is addressed. I mentioned Pope Francis. Yeah, I'm a Pope Francis fan, which is interesting historically for somebody from with a tradition that would be regarded as Protestant. I like to just think I'm a Christian and be done with it. Pope Francis came from a South American background, and he was influenced by what we might call liberation theology. And previously, again, they got into trouble with the Vatican because they said a load of Marxists, But that's the sort of background that Francis came out of. Had a difficult time as a cardinal where he was. But he also brought through and repurposed the ideas of St. Francis, who insisted on this family relationship of all creatures. And he makes some things very clear, that just as you can't say you love God and despise your fellow human, you cannot say you are green and despise your fellow human. St. Francis insisted also that every monastery should have a flower meadow, because that would direct people's thoughts to God. And what have we got happening all across Europe, where churches have patches of land, even the Germans, they are opening it up and planting wildflowers and welcoming the bees and letting creepers grow on the buildings and letting this glorious untidiness creep in and rejoicing in it. By contrast, I will mention a shocking correspondence I had with an organisation which has for years been preparing Christian material for children. And I looked through the newsletter they'd sent me, and I asked them, why is there no mention at all of climate or environment in this? And they said that would detract from the worship of God. And you do wonder what Bible these folks are reading. I mean, really. By contrast, there's an organisation called Tear Fund. That's a broadly evangelical Protestant aid agency, and they've been full on with their campaigns. They've done a survey showing that if you say nothing about the environment, it's a good way of disillusioning your younger people and pissing off your older people too, quite frankly, as I've also heard. Environmental spirituality is necessarily multi-age group, because the old idea that people had, and this is what has drawn people into the movement I'm part of, that you will bequeath a nice planet to your grandchildren, that's gone. The time scale has collapsed. Everyone here who's alive, it's going to affect you. It's not just future anymore. So above all, environmental spirituality has become a spirituality of crisis, of urgency, where procrastination can no longer be passed off as wisdom. I do remember a very eminent Church of Scotland person saying, "We need to say, 'Slow us down, Lord.'" I can't say amen to that.